In the biggest private house ever built in America, there's a gate in one of the corridors. It is not there to stop a child, or a draft, or a thief. The mistress of the house had it put in to keep the housekeeper's dogs out of the family's hallway, and the woman those dogs belonged to carried, on a chain at her waist, the keys to almost every locked door in the building. Both of those things are true. She could open the storerooms, she could open the pantries, the china closet, the still room where the preserves and the medicines were kept. Nearly 40 people worked under her roof, and there was one corridor where her dogs weren't welcome, and a small iron gate went in to make that permanent. That gate is still there. You can walk past it today, and almost nobody does, because there's nothing to look at. It's a small piece of ironwork in a service corridor, in a house full of Renoirs. If you're settling in for the night, this is a good moment to get comfortable. Pull something warm over you if you can. I'd love it if you subscribed, because this is the kind of story I want to keep telling, and it helps more than you'd think. And before you drift, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what the time is where you are. I read them all, and it's the best part of doing this. She arrived in the summer of 1897, and the house wasn't quite 2 years old. Her name was Emily Rand King. She was born on the 7th of December, 1853, in a village in Essex called Horndon on the Hill. It's a small place even now. By her early 20s, she was working as a domestic servant for a doctor in London, which was a respectable position and a limited one. Somewhere between that London house and the mountains of western North Carolina, she made a decision we have no record of. She crossed the Atlantic. She came through New York. And sometime before August of 1897, she arrived at Biltmore. She was 43 years old. She had no husband and no money of her own, and she was about to be handed the largest house in the United States, not given it, handed the running of it, which, as it turns out, is the more interesting thing to be handed, and the harder one to give back. The size of that step is easy to miss. A doctor's house in London is a substantial establishment by ordinary standards. It might have 3 or 4 servants. She'd have known every room in it and every person in it, and the whole thing would fit inside Biltmore's stable block. Then she crossed an ocean, took a train into the Blue Ridge, and walked into a building with 250 rooms that had been finished 18 months earlier and was still, in some sense, being worked out. Nobody at Biltmore had done this before either. The house was under 2 years old. There was no long-established way of running it, no generations of custom to fall back on, no previous housekeeper with decades of accumulated practice to hand it over. Laura Barker had held the post for 2 years and gone. So the arrangements Emily King inherited were barely arrangements. A great deal of how that house actually ran, for the next 17 years, is going to be whatever she decided it was. That's a strange kind of freedom to hand somebody, and it came without any of the authority that normally goes with it. She could decide almost everything about how the house worked and nothing at all about her own position in it. That phrase gets thrown around until it stops meaning anything, so here are the numbers. Biltmore House runs to nearly 180,000 square feet, 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, and 65 fireplaces, and 43 bathrooms, at a time when most American families were still walking out to a privy in the cold. George Washington Vanderbilt II built it between 1889 and 1895. The family opened it at Christmas in 1895. It's still, more than a century later, the largest privately owned house in the country. Nobody has beaten it. Nobody has really tried. Now hold that against the other number, 40. In the years when George, Edith, and Cornelia Vanderbilt lived there, the house and the stable together employed up to 40 domestic staff, 250 rooms, 40 people. That's roughly 6 rooms each if you divided it up evenly, which nobody did. Some rooms were opened once a season. Some were opened every morning before anyone in the family was awake. Somebody had to know which was which, and somebody had to keep the list. And after the summer of 1897, that somebody was Emily King. Here's the thing about the keys. We tend to imagine the wealth of a house like this, living in the paintings and the tapestries and the marble, and it does. But the actual working wealth of a great house, the part that gets eaten and burned and worn out and stolen, lived behind locks, sugar and tea and coffee, spices, wine, linen, candles, silver, medicine. Every one of those things had a value and a rate of disappearance, and every one of them sat behind a door that only opened for one person. The head housekeeper held those keys: storerooms, pantries, the china closet, the room where the preserves were kept. She didn't keep those keys in a drawer. She wore them on a chatelaine, which is a hooked clasp worn at the waist with the keys hanging from it, and she wore it at all times. 17 years of that weight against the hip, the sound it makes when you walk, which means everyone in the service corridors always knows exactly where you are and roughly how fast you're moving. There's no such thing as arriving quietly when you're the housekeeper. The job announces you. And it works the other way too. Those keys are the whole of your authority, and they're detachable. You can be asked for them back. Everything she had in that house hung off a hook at her waist, and it could be unhooked. A chatelaine, if you've never seen one, carries more than keys. A senior housekeeper's might also hold a small pair of scissors, a thimble case, a pencil, and a notebook. It's a tool belt for a woman whose tools are access and information. And it was worn, not carried, for a reason. If the keys live in a drawer, then anyone who knows which drawer has the keys. If they live in a pocket, a coat gets hung up. If they're bolted to the person, then the keys and the accountability are the same object, and they go home to the same bed. The first hour of a day, when you're the one wearing it, goes something like this. Somebody needs sugar for the kitchen. Somebody needs candles for the second floor. The laundry's run out of starch. A guest has arrived unexpectedly, and a bedroom that hasn't been opened in 6 weeks needs linen out of a locked press. None of those things can happen without her walking there and turning a key, and every one of them is a small interruption to whatever she was doing. The friction is the point, and it was designed in. Every locked door is a moment where somebody has to ask, and asking creates a record, even if the record only lives in her head. The part that gets missed is that a system like that doesn't only control theft, it controls waste, which in a house feeding 40 staff and a rotating cast of guests is a much larger number. Nobody takes 3 candles when one will do if they have to go and ask the housekeeper for them. The keys were a budget with legs, and when a housekeeper left a position, the handover was the keys. No meeting, no document. She took the chatelaine off and gave it to the next woman, and in that moment, the entire working knowledge of the building had to transfer as well. because the keys are useless without knowing what's behind each door and how fast it goes off and who's allowed to ask for it. Emily King did that handover twice. Once when she took it in 1897, once when she gave it back 17 years later. And the first of those two moments is one I'd give a great deal to have seen. A woman of 43, 3 weeks off a ship, standing in a hallway in a valley she'd never heard of a year earlier, while somebody unhooked a chain of keys and handed it to her. Nobody wrote down what was said. Nobody thought it was worth recording. It was simply the morning the house changed hands, in the only sense that mattered day to day, and the person it changed hands to had arrived from a village in Essex with a trunk. She wore a black dress. That was the convention for a head housekeeper, and it did a specific job. In a house where the maids wore print in the morning and black in the afternoon, where the footmen wore livery with monogrammed buttons, where the lady's maid wore her mistress's cast-off gowns as a mark of favor, the housekeeper's plain black said something quite precise. She wasn't a servant you'd mistake for a servant. She was the one you asked. She was addressed as Mrs. King. The house believed she was unmarried at the time, and it made no difference at all. Mrs. was a courtesy title, given for authority and age and respect, and every senior housekeeper in a house of that class got it whether she had a husband or not. If you've watched Downton Abbey, you already know the convention, without knowing you knew it. So that's the arrangement. A woman of 43, in a black dress, with a chain of keys at her waist, standing in a chateau with 39 other people in it. Here's something that surprises people about a house like this. The servants' hall had its own class system, and it was stricter than the one upstairs. The family's hierarchy was inherited and mostly fixed. Below stairs it was earned, contested, and enforced daily by people who had nothing else to enforce. There was an order of precedence, and everybody knew exactly where they stood in it. The housekeeper and the butler at the top, then the chef, who was slightly outside the system and often paid more than either, then the lady's maid and the valet, who ranked oddly high because they were personally attached to the family and heard things, then the head housemaid, the footmen in order of seniority, the under housemaids, the kitchen maids, the laundry maids, and at the very bottom the scullery maid, who was frequently 14 years old and washed the pots. In many houses of the period, meals in the servants' hall began with everyone together and then split. The senior staff would rise partway through and withdraw to the housekeeper's sitting room for the rest of the meal, taking the pudding with them. The room they went to was known in some houses, only half-jokingly, as the pug's parlor. That does something specific to a dining room. You sit down together. Then, at a fixed moment, the 4 or 5 most important people in the room stand up and leave, and the rest of you finish your meal without them. It also means that being promoted in that house came with a specific and public loss. The day you rose high enough to leave the table early was the day you stopped eating with the people you'd sat beside for years. Emily King ate in her own sitting room, not with the family, obviously, and not with the maids either. The fine detail of hall precedence varied house to house, so treat that as period convention rather than documented Biltmore practice. What the Biltmore record does tell us directly is that she had her own sitting room, that she was provided with horses, and that her dogs lived in the building. Those 3 facts on their own tell you she was not living the life of the women she supervised. And they tell you something else, which is that seniority in service bought you privacy, and privacy in a house full of people was the rarest thing there was. The shape of the building is the shape of the story, so walk through it with me. A great house of this period is really two buildings wearing one roof. There's the house the guests see, wide staircases with hand-carved rails, rooms that open into other rooms so that a woman in a long dress can move through them without ever turning around awkwardly, windows placed for the view, ceilings placed for the eye. Everything about that half of the house is designed to feel effortless, which is a word worth holding on to, because effortlessness isn't the absence of effort. It's effort that's been moved somewhere you can't see it. And then there's the other building, narrow stairs, often uncarpeted, so that footsteps are quick rather than quiet. Corridors that run behind and beneath the good rooms. Doors cut into paneling so that they vanish when they're shut. Kitchens, a rotisserie kitchen and a pastry kitchen, as well as a main one, because a house at that level cooked in parallel rather than in sequence. Laundries, drying rooms, and storerooms behind locks. Two buildings, one shell, and the entire art of running a household like this was making sure that a person from building 2 could reach any point in building 1 within a couple of minutes, at any hour, without ever being seen crossing the gap. That's not a metaphor. It's a floor plan. Architects drew it deliberately. It gave the housekeeper a geography nobody else in the building shared. The family moved through the good rooms and never the others. The maids moved through the service side and crossed over, only to work, quickly, early, ideally unseen. She crossed constantly, both directions, all day, as the only person whose job required her to be equally at home on either side of the wall. It's an odd place to stand. You know both halves of a building designed so neither half sees the other. You know what the drawing room looks like at 4 in the afternoon and what the scullery looks like at 6 in the morning, and nobody else in that house knows both. One of the things she'd have had to learn fast, arriving in 1897, is that a house of that period is not one building. And she was learning it in public, in front of 39 people who already knew it. That's the position every new senior servant walked into. You outrank people on your first morning who have been in the building longer than you and know things you don't. And the only way through is to be visibly right about enough small decisions, quickly enough that nobody tests you on a large one. Some of them never managed it. Laura Barker had the post for 2 years. Martha Louise Andrews, after her, lasted 1. Whatever Emily King did in her first 6 months, she did it well enough to hold the job for another 16 and a half years. It's a machine, with rooms on top, and the machine has a logic she was now responsible for. Down the coast in Newport, the Vanderbilts had another house called The Breakers, and it shows you the same logic taken to its conclusion. Roughly 70 rooms, and about 33 of them were servants' rooms. Nearly half the house existed to service the other half. The machinery went further down than that. The boilers that heated the breakers weren't in the house at all. They sat in a vault built under the front lawn, and the heat traveled to the building through a service tunnel roughly 360 feet long, made of brick and steel, running about 10 feet below the ground. Guests walked across that grass on a summer evening with drinks in their hands. Underneath their shoes, men were shoveling coal in the dark to keep the rooms above at the temperature those guests expected. The house also had a call bell system, monitored from the butler's pantry, with speaking tubes running to the family's rooms. Somebody upstairs presses a button. Somewhere below, a bell rings, and a little indicator drops. And a person who was doing something else 5 seconds ago is now walking. The technology of the Gilded Age was built for exactly this. It bought speed of summoning rather than comfort. And speed of summoning is only worth anything if somebody is organizing what happens when the summons lands. A bell tells you a room wants something. It doesn't tell you whether there's anybody free to go, or whether the thing being asked for is in the storeroom, or whether the person nearest the stairs is already carrying something for somebody else. That coordination was hers, continuously, in her head, for the whole working day. The technology moved requests around the building faster than a voice could. She was the reason the requests turned into anything. The bells are worth one moment, and not for the engineering. Because she'd have learned the board the way everybody learned it, which is by being wrong. A new person hears a bell and goes to the wrong floor. After a month, you know the sound of the house. After a year, you know, from where a bell falls in the sequence and what hour it is, roughly what's about to be asked of you before you get there. She had years of it. By the end, she was reading a building the way other people read a face. Consider the daily reality of that. You're somewhere in the lower part of the house, doing a job that takes both hands. A bell rings. You put the job down, you look at the board, you go. You don't know what's wanted. It might be a fire that needs making up. It might be a dropped glove. It might be nothing you'd consider a reason. You go at the same speed regardless, because the speed is the service. And you come back and pick the job up again, and 8 minutes later, another bell rings. The work had that texture all day. Not one long task, but a day of tasks, all interruptible by people who don't know they're interrupting and would be surprised to hear they were. There's a phrase that turns up in histories of service that has always struck me as exactly right. The staff of a great house were required to be simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. Everywhere because the fire is always lit, and the water is always hot, and the door is always answered. Nowhere because the moment you can actually see the person doing it, the illusion breaks. The architecture helped. The bells helped. But mostly what made it work was 40 people agreeing, every single day, to behave as though they were furniture that happened to move. And it wasn't humiliating in the way we might assume from here. It was professional. There was pride in doing it well, real skill in doing it invisibly, and a hierarchy that rewarded both. A footman who could serve a table of 20 without a sound was good at something difficult, and he knew it, and so did everybody below stairs. The indignity, where there was one, wasn't in the work. It was in the fact that being excellent at it still left you sleeping in an attic, eating separately, and fenced out of one corridor. You start to see the design principle. The family should never have to wait, and should never have to watch anyone work. And there's a design principle underneath all of it that's worth naming. The money went toward hiding labor rather than reducing it. An electric bell doesn't save anyone a single step. What it removes is the need for a family member to raise their voice, or go looking, or acknowledge that somebody is waiting somewhere to be summoned. There's one bell in that system that didn't work like the others, and it was hers. A footman answering a bell is answering a request. When the housekeeper was sent for, it was usually because something had gone wrong that nobody below her could fix, or because a decision was needed that only she could make. Which means she spent 17 years being summoned to problems, not to fetch and carry, to resolve. That's a different job and a different kind of tiredness, and it's the reason her post was worth what it was worth. There's a second thing that Belle tells you, and it took me a while to see it. Everybody else in that building was answering a bell rung by somebody above them. She was answering bells rung by people below her. A maid finds a broken window. A laundress finds a stain that won't lift. A footman finds a guest who has arrived on the wrong day. Every one of those goes up the chain to her and stops there, because above her is the family, and the whole point of the arrangement is that the family never hears about it. So the house had two directions of travel, and she was the ceiling for one of them. Everything went up until it reached her, and then it turned into a decision instead of a problem. That's the actual reason a household of that size needed somebody in her post at all. Not the cleaning, not even the keys. Somebody has to be the place where trouble stops traveling. So why would anyone spend that kind of money on not being seen to spend it? 13 years before Biltmore opened, on the 26th of March, 1883, George Vanderbilt's brother William and his wife Alva threw a costume ball at their house at 665th Avenue. It was a French chateau designed by Richard Morris Hunt, who'd later design Biltmore. Around 1,200 people came. The newspapers of the day put the cost at about $250,000, 65,000 of that on champagne, 11,000 on flowers. The Vanderbilt money was railroad money, and it was new. New money, in New York at that moment, meant you could be the richest family in the country and still not be received by the people who mattered. The gatekeeper was Caroline Astor, who by common consent decided who counted in New York, and the mechanism of her gate was absurdly small. She had to call on you. She had to leave her visiting card at your door. Until a card arrived, you didn't socially exist, and the Vanderbilts had been not existing for years. Alva Vanderbilt's move was to throw the most talked-about party in America, and then let it be known that the Astor daughter couldn't be invited, because the families had never been formally introduced, and how could you send an invitation to a house you'd never been asked to visit? Caroline Astor left her card at 665th Avenue. The invitation went out the next day. These houses were built for that world, a world where an entire dynasty's position could turn on a small rectangle of card, and where the only way to force the issue was an overwhelming, flawless, absolutely correct performance of hospitality. And now go back and look at the machinery with that in mind. The bells, the tunnel, the hidden stairs, the woman with the keys. That machinery isn't comfort, it's competitive infrastructure. If one dinner runs badly, if the food's cold, if a room's not warm, if a guest sees a footman struggling with something, that's not an inconvenience. That's evidence, and it travels. And in a world that adjudicated families on exactly this, it costs you. So the standard wasn't high because the Vanderbilts were fussy. It was high because the house was an argument they were making about themselves, and every single person below stairs was holding part of it up. Which means that when Emily King went in every morning with the chef's menus, she wasn't managing a household. She was maintaining the family's standing, one correctly warmed room at a time. Nobody said that out loud. Nobody had to. Everybody in that building understood exactly what was at stake in a badly laid table. Now hold that against the household. Every one of those calls arrived at a front door that a footman opened. Every card went into a bowl that somebody emptied. Every invitation was written. And at Biltmore, when Mrs. Vanderbilt wasn't there, some of them were written by the housekeeper. The servants of that world weren't outside the status system. They were its infrastructure. They knew who had called and who hadn't. They knew which invitations went out and which names quietly didn't appear. A footman, standing at a door for 2 hours during calling hours, had a more accurate picture of a family's social position than most of the family's friends, and they were required to know it and never to use it, and that was the job. Hold complete information about other people's standing, act on it correctly 100 times a day, and never once let on that you have it. Which is why a phrase like "the secrets they took to their graves" is not really about scandal. Most of what those households knew was not scandalous at all. It was ordinary, granular, continuous knowledge about how a family actually worked, held by people who were structurally forbidden from ever repeating it, and who mostly didn't. The houses also came with a calendar, and hers was the one job in the household that the calendar didn't move. A family at this level didn't live in one house. They moved. New York for the winter season, when society did its business. Newport for 6 or 8 weeks in high summer. Europe for months at a stretch. A shooting estate or a country place in between. Biltmore, for the Vanderbilts, was the mountain house, and it filled up around Christmas and again in the spring. Moving a household is not the same as moving a family. The people go, obviously, but so does a good part of the establishment. A lady's maid travels. A valet travels. A chef often travels. Or a second cook goes ahead. Trunks are packed by somebody. And the packing of trunks at that level was a genuine skill, because a gown that arrives creased is a gown that failed. Meanwhile, the house you've just left doesn't empty. It shifts into a different mode, with a skeleton staff, dust sheets going over the furniture, shutters closed against the light, because light fades fabric, and somebody staying behind to make sure the pipes don't freeze and the damp doesn't get in. Then the whole thing runs in reverse when a telegram fixes a return date. That was the rhythm of the year for everybody in service at that level. You are either in a house that is performing or in a house that is being kept alive until it performs again. And the woman deciding which staff went where and which rooms got opened when, and how much food to order against an arrival that might move, was the housekeeper. There's a version of this life that sounds glamorous. Newport in July, New York for the season. And for a lady's maid who traveled, some of that was real, because she saw places she'd never have seen otherwise, and ate food she'd never have eaten. But look at the shape of it from the other side. You have no home. Your bed is wherever the family currently is. Your possessions fit in whatever you can carry, because you move several times a year. You cannot have a settled relationship with anyone outside the household because you are never in one place long enough. And when the family is in Europe for 4 months, you are either with them, entirely dependent, or you are in an empty house waiting. Emily King, as far as the record shows, did not travel with them. She stayed. She stayed in one valley, while the people she worked for moved between continents. There's a way of reading that as a limitation, and there's a better one. The traveling servants, the lady's maid and the valet, were the most personally intimate with the family and the least powerful in the building. They went where they were taken. Their whole position depended on one person continuing to want them nearby. The housekeeper who stayed had the opposite arrangement. She was less intimate and far more autonomous. For months at a time, nobody in that valley outranked her. She wasn't waiting to be needed. She was running something. That's a real choice, and the length of her stay suggests she'd made it. Which brings us back to Emily King, standing in a house built on exactly that principle, holding the keys to the parts of it that mattered. Because here's what she was actually responsible for, and the list is longer than most people expect. She was responsible for cleaning the house, all of it. She was responsible for the care of the staff, which in a residential household means their food, their rooms, their sickness, and their conduct. She hired people. She fired people. She handled the household accounts, which is to say, she was moving significant sums of somebody else's money and answering for every line of it. 3 of those are much heavier than they sound. Start with the care of the staff. In a house where the workers live in, the employer isn't just an employer. They're the landlord, the caterer, and, when things go wrong, the nearest thing to a hospital. If a kitchen maid came down with something in February, she didn't go home. There often wasn't a home to go to within a day's travel. She went to bed upstairs, and somebody had to decide whether she needed a doctor who was covering her work, whether whatever she had was going to move through a floor of shared bedrooms, and how long the house could carry her before that stopped being sustainable. The family were never asked. That decision was hers, and she made it in a corridor, in the time it takes to look at somebody. And the same woman was responsible for conduct. 40 people, most of them young, most of them unmarried, living in the same building with very little privacy and even less to do in the evenings. Houses of that period had rules about it that look absurd now and made complete sense then. Separate stairs for men and women in some establishments. Curfews. Restrictions on followers, which is the period word for a sweetheart. Somebody had to enforce all of that, and enforcing it meant knowing things about people that they'd rather you didn't. Then the hiring and firing, which is the part with real teeth. In domestic service at the time, leaving a position wasn't like leaving a job now. You needed a character. That's a written reference from your previous employer, and without one, you were close to unemployable in service anywhere in the country. No character, no position, and for a young woman with no family money, the options narrowed very quickly, and none of them were good. So when Emily King let somebody go, she wasn't ending an income. She was, depending on what she wrote afterwards, deciding what kind of life that person got to have next. She was doing the same thing in reverse every time she hired. A young woman arrives from a county farm with a character from a small household, and somebody has to judge whether she'll cope in a house this size with a French chef in it. Get that wrong, and you've taken a person out of a life she could manage and put her somewhere she can't, and then you have to write the letter that follows her. There's no training for that. There's no procedure. There's one woman deciding, on a conversation and a piece of paper, and living with the result down the corridor from her for the next several years. Multiply it across 17 years, and a staff that turned over constantly, and she must have made that judgment well over 100 times. Every one of them landed on somebody, none of which makes her cruel. The record suggests the opposite, if anything. I say it because it's the actual weight of the job, and it's invisible in every photograph of a grand staircase you've ever seen. And then the money. She carried the accounts for a building where the annual running cost was enormous, and every item passed through her hands or her signature. She wasn't advising on a budget. She was the internal controls. Put those four things together, and you've a role that in any modern organization would be split across an operations director, a facilities manager, a head of human resources, and a financial controller. One woman, no deputy except the butler, and a job title that sounds like she dusted. And every single morning she met the Vanderbilts. The daily rhythm of the house began with the housekeeper going into the family, reviewing the menus the chef had suggested, and working through the plans for whoever was staying and whatever they were going to be doing that day. Then out, and down to the chef and the butler, and the three of them turned the family's wishes into instructions. 2 meetings every morning, one with the people who owned the house, one with the people who ran it. She was the hinge. She and the head butler supervised all the staff between them, with one exception. The kitchen staff worked for the chef, and the chef was his own kingdom, which is a very old arrangement in houses of that kind. Her authority is easier to picture once you know who it was over. So here's the establishment she walked into. They weren't a category. They had names, and the house wrote them down. There was a butler called Walter Harvey, who was English, and who held the post from 1897 to 1899. Then John Burdett, also English, from 1899 to 1906. The butler was the highest-ranking man in the house. He made sure 3 meals a day and afternoon tea reached the family and their guests without a visible seam. He looked after the china, the crystal and the silver. He decanted and served the wine. He arranged the flowers for the dining table. He wound the clocks. He greeted people at the door. There was a chef named Beck Vivian, who was English, around 1900. A cook called James Sepperline, who was French. Another cook, Esther Anderson, who was Swedish, around 1904. Cordelia Curtis, pastry cook. Annie Scarborough, kitchen maid, from 1898 to 1900. And later, in 1915, a cook named Patience Randall, who was a Black American woman working in the largest house in the country. There was a laundress called Inga Boberg, who was Swedish. Frances Collins, a Black American woman, working the laundry around 1900. Later, Sarah Scott. From about 1928 to 1932, there was a footman named William McSelland, who was Irish. Footmen served in formal livery, polished the entire silver collection every single day, answered the door, and acted as valets for any gentleman guest who arrived without his own. There were maids, Sarah Auld, who was Canadian, Mary Curtis and Emily Curtis, Annie Moore, a Black American woman, around 1904, Louise Anderson, who was Swedish. Chambermaids looked after bedrooms. Parlor maids looked after the shared rooms. Both of them laid fires, changed linen, and got rooms ready for the evening. And both of them also served the meals in the staff dining room, because the people who fed the household still had to be fed. Before we move on, I want to stop on one of those names, because I nearly walked past her and I shouldn't have. Patience Randall, cook, 1915. A Black American woman, cooking in the largest private house in the United States, in western North Carolina, in 1915. Think about what that year means in that state. Segregation was law, and it was tightening. The men who ran North Carolina had spent the previous 15 years systematically stripping black citizens of the vote. And in a chateau on 8,000 acres, a black woman was running food out of one of the finest kitchens in America for a family at the very top of the country's social order. We know almost nothing else about her. A name, a role, a year. The archive kept that. She isn't the only one. Frances Collins worked the Biltmore laundry around the turn of the century. Annie Moore was a maid around 1904. Sarah Scott was still in that laundry in the late 1920s, 30 years after Frances Collins. 4 black women, named in the records of a house that most people picture as entirely white, below stairs as well as above. Worth saying plainly, because the popular image of a great house comes from British television, and it is not what an American estate actually looked like. Biltmore's staff was English and Irish and French and Swedish and Italian and Dutch and North Carolinian. And some of those North Carolinians were black women whose names the house wrote down and whose lives it did not. I can't tell you what Patience Randall's day was like, because nobody recorded it. I can tell you she worked under a chef in a kitchen, with a rotisserie room and a pastry room attached, that she was cooking for a family and their guests and 40 staff, and that she was doing it in a state that had spent a generation making her life harder on purpose. The record gives us her name. It's not much. It's more than most people in her position got, and it's the reason we can say she existed at all. Now, the other thing that list hides is the shape of the thing. The list has a shape to it. Across the years, the house lists an English housekeeper, an Irish butler, a French chef, a Swedish laundress, an Italian stable boss, and a Dutch valet. Not all at once, and not always the ones we can name. There are American women from the surrounding counties working alongside women who'd crossed an ocean to get there. That's a workforce assembled from 4 countries and 2 continents to keep one family comfortable in the mountains of North Carolina. And the man who assembled it did something that gets less attention than it deserves. George Vanderbilt paid New York wages in Asheville, room, board, and uniforms on top. In a regional labor market where the going rate was considerably lower, he imported the pay scale along with the staff. That's the kind of detail that gets flattened out when we talk about the Gilded Age, as though every rich man in it were identical. He wasn't running a charity. He was running the largest house in America, and he needed people who wouldn't leave. But think about what that recruitment actually required, because it's a much stranger achievement than the wage figure suggests. Asheville, in the 1890s, was a mountain town. Beautiful, remote, and a very long way from anywhere that trained a French chef. If you wanted somebody who'd worked in a great London house or a Paris kitchen, you couldn't advertise locally. You had to go and find them, persuade them to cross an ocean, and then persuade them to stay in the Blue Ridge afterwards. And a lot of them did stay. John Burdett, butler, 7 years. Wilfred Shackley, valet, 7 years. Emily Curtis appears in the records as a maid for something like 16. Emily King, 17. And the woman at the top of that hierarchy was Mrs. King. There's a loneliness built into that arrangement that nobody designed on purpose, and everybody in the job would have recognized. You're senior enough that nobody below you can be a friend, and you're staff, so nobody above you can be either. She did that for 17 years, in a valley 800 miles from anyone she'd grown up with. But before we go anywhere near what that pay actually meant, we should be honest about a problem in the record, because the numbers here are slipperier than they look, and I'd rather you knew that than have me sound more certain than the evidence allows. Here's what the house's own account says. Wages for the higher-ranking staff could run up to $2, and a week of room and board at the time typically cost $2.50. The record doesn't say whether that $2 was a day or a week, and those are wildly different lives, so I'll use the comparison the house itself chose rather than guess at the rate. Senior wages, measured against the cost of existing indoors for 7 days, not against a holiday, not against savings, against having somewhere to sleep and something to eat. And of course, at Biltmore, the room and the board were provided. No small thing in that trade. It's the entire economic logic of domestic service, and it explains a great deal about why people took these jobs and stayed in them. If you lived out, your wage had to cover rent, food, fuel, light, and clothing before it covered anything else. If you lived in, all of that came with the position. Your wage was, in effect, spending money and savings. A housemaid earning a low monthly figure could actually put more away than a factory girl earning twice as much and paying for a room in a boarding house. She had a sitting room of her own. That's recorded, alongside the horses and the dogs, as one of the privileges of her position. To understand why a room with a door counts as a privilege, you have to know what everybody else in that building had, and the privacy is the part hardest to feel from here. Your bedroom was at the top of the house, under the roof. Nothing decorative about it. It's the cheapest space in the building to finish. It's furthest from the family, and heat rises, which sounds like an advantage, until you understand it means unbearable in August, and, once the fires below have gone out, genuinely cold in January. You almost certainly shared it. 2 to a room was normal, 3 not unusual for the lower positions, and the beds were narrow. Your possessions fitted in a small trunk or a chest, because that's the storage a servant's room provided, and because you might be moving to another house within a year or 2. There was no lock on your side of the door in most establishments. The housekeeper could enter your room. That was not considered intrusive. It was considered supervision, and it applied to your letters and your visitors as much as your linen. You had, in a building of 250 rooms, no square foot of it that was yours. The women in that attic were, at the same time, surrounded constantly. You worked beside the same people, ate beside them, slept beside them, and had almost no way of getting away from any of them. If you fell out with the woman in the next bed, you fell out with her for the length of your employment, and you still had to share a candle. So much for living in. Not solitude and not company, but a permanent crowded absence of privacy, in a house designed around the privacy of 6 people. And this is where the housekeeper's own sitting room stops looking like a small perk and starts looking like the actual prize. A door you could close, a room nobody else entered without knocking. After 20 years of attic bedrooms and shared candles, that is not a minor upgrade. That might be most of the reason to want the job at all. There's the bargain. You handed over your time, your privacy, your ability to marry in most houses, and your right to be somewhere your employer wasn't. And in exchange, you got a bed, 3 meals, a uniform, and a wage you could mostly keep. For a great many people, that was the best arrangement available to them, and they knew it, and they weren't wrong. There's a hard little truth sitting inside how that house paid people, and it's the same truth that runs through every wage argument since. It did not pay for effort. It paid for how difficult you were to replace. A housemaid could be found in the surrounding counties inside a week. A chef who could produce a 9-course dinner for 30 without a visible error could not be found in a season and might have to be brought from Europe. And the housekeeper? The housekeeper sat right at the top of that scarcity problem, which is why her range was so enormous. $50 a month to $150. That's a 3-fold spread for the same job title, and it depended entirely on whether the family thought they'd found the right woman. Now let's ask the question that actually matters, which isn't what she earned, it's what else she could have done. For a woman in 1897, without capital, without a husband, and without a profession, the realistic options were roughly these. She could work in a factory or a mill. The wages were often better on paper, and the hours were brutal. The work was dangerous, and you paid for your own room and your own food out of what you earned, which ate most of it. You also had no security whatsoever. Trade goes bad, the mill puts people off, and there's nothing underneath you. She could take in work at home, sewing, laundry, lodgers. That meant being poor with more independence, which some women chose deliberately, and which is a perfectly rational trade. She could marry if somebody suitable appeared and if she wanted to, which is 2 large conditions stacked on each other. Or she could go into service and take the arrangement we've already seen. And within service, there was one more thing, and it's the thing I think explains Emily King's entire career. Service had a ladder. Almost nothing else available to her did. You could start as a scullery maid at 14, which is the bottom, washing pots, move to kitchen maid, move to housemaid, then head housemaid, and if you were good and lucky and somebody noticed, housekeeper. That's a genuine career with genuine promotion, in a century where women were largely locked out of every other one. She'd worked for a doctor in London in her 20s. 20 years later, she held the keys to America's biggest house. Luck alone doesn't do that. That's a ladder, and she climbed the whole thing. Here's the trade she made to do it, stated plainly, because I don't want to make it sound better than it was. She almost certainly couldn't marry while she held the post. Most great houses didn't employ married senior women, and the courtesy title of Mrs. that she carried was in part a formal acknowledgement that she was married to the job instead. She had no home of her own for 17 years. Her room was in her workplace. She had no evenings that weren't on call, because the house doesn't stop at 6, and no privacy from the 40 people she supervised. And she got authority, security, and the respect of everybody in that building. That's the bargain. It's not a good one by our standards, and it was a very good one by the standards available to her. And both of those statements are true at the same time. The women who took it weren't victims of a con. They were people making the best available choice in a narrow field, and a great many of them were extremely good at what they chose. Emily King held that post for 17 years. 17 years isn't a wage figure, but it's a piece of evidence, and in some ways it's better than one. Nobody keeps a difficult employee in that role for 17 years in a house of that size. The record doesn't need to tell us what she was worth. Her employment does. She didn't run the kitchens. That was the chef, and it was the one part of the establishment carved out of her authority entirely. But she ordered against them, stored for them, and answered for what they spent, and the kitchens tell you something the drawing rooms can't. 3 of them, as we've seen, each built for a different kind of heat and a different kind of work. That sounds like extravagance, and it isn't. The point is throughput. A formal dinner is not one meal cooked once. It's 8 or 9 courses that all have to arrive at the correct temperature in a fixed order. And roasting, baking, and pastry want completely different conditions. Put them in one room and they fight each other. Give them 3 rooms and a chef who can hold the whole sequence in his head, and dinner arrives looking effortless. And the kitchens weren't only feeding the family, they fed everybody. Most people miss that detail. A house of 40 staff is a house serving between 50 and 80 meals a day before a single guest arrives. Breakfast for the staff, dinner for the staff, usually at midday, which was the main meal, supper in the evening, plus whatever the family and their guests are having, which is a different menu entirely, cooked to a different standard, out of the same kitchens. The chef's kingdom, in other words, was not a luxury outpost. It was a canteen with a fine dining operation bolted to it, and both ran every day. The food itself came from closer than you'd think. Biltmore was not just a house, it was an estate with farms on it, and a great deal of what came into those kitchens was grown or raised within sight of the building. Dairy, poultry, vegetables in season, fruit from the gardens and the glass houses. The still room existed precisely because more came in during August than anyone could eat in August. That's a working farm feeding a working household, with a chateau attached. None of that is glamorous, and all of it was hers. The chef decided what a dinner should be. She decided whether the house could afford it that week, whether the storeroom had it, and what happened to the surplus when it didn't get used. Those are not the same job, and the second one is the one nobody writes down. So watch some of that work happen, because there's one day in the record that shows you the whole machine at full pressure. The laundry was hers, and it was the part of the house most likely to go wrong. Everything in it ran on a timetable she set against weather she couldn't control, and everything downstream of it, the beds, the tables, the guests, the family's clothes, stopped when it slipped. So the laundry is where you can actually see what she was managing. The year is 1908. A report from the house documents a single day in the laundry. On that day, 2 laundresses processed hundreds of linens, sheets, tablecloths, towels. And while they were doing that, 2 more women ironed hundreds of items: stockings and handkerchiefs, towels and napkins, pillowcases, petticoats, skirts. That's 4 women in one day, doing hundreds of pieces between them. You need to understand what washing meant then, because the word has become almost meaningless to us. There was no machine doing the work. Washing a load of linen was a multi-day process, and it went roughly like this: sort by fabric and by how dirty it was, because you can't treat everything the same. Soak. Scrub with lye soap, which strips grease and also strips skin. Scrub again. Rinse with boiling water, which has to be carried. Sometimes boil the whites outright. Blue them so they read white instead of yellow. Starch them, and the starch recipe changed depending on the garment, so a collar and a petticoat got different formulas, and you were expected to know which. Wring by hand or through a mangle. Dry, and then iron, with irons heated on a stove, which means you're working with a hot metal weight in a hot room and swapping it for another one the moment it cools. Now do that with hundreds of pieces, on a summer day, in a room built for the purpose, which means built with drainage and heat, and no particular concern for whether anyone in it was comfortable. And every one of those pieces belonged to somebody who'd never see the room it was cleaned in. Here's the part of that which was hers specifically. 4 women can process hundreds of pieces in a day, and the house absorbs it, right up until the week it can't. A wet spell, 1 woman ill, a house party nobody warned you about, and the linen for Friday is still damp on Thursday night. At which point somebody decides which beds get the good sheets and which get the older ones, whether a guest room stays shut rather than opened badly, whether 2 maids come off the work they're supposed to be doing, and what then doesn't get done at all. She made those calls on the information she had, with no way of knowing on Tuesday what Friday would need. And the measure of whether she made them well is that across 17 years of surviving correspondence, nobody upstairs seems to have noticed there was ever a decision to make. A woman put on a fresh petticoat in the morning, crisp, white, correctly starched. She had no reason to think about it, and thinking about it would have been slightly vulgar. The whole point of the arrangement was that the petticoat simply appeared, the way the heat simply appeared, the way the light simply appeared. The phrase invisible labor describes exactly that. Not hidden work. Work that's been designed to be unnoticeable by people who understood exactly what they were designing. And that was one day, not a special day, a documented day. The week around it looks like this. Linen doesn't arrive in one delivery. It arrives constantly. Every bed in use produces sheets and pillowcases. Every meal produces napkins and tablecloths. And a formal dinner produces a lot of both. Every person in the house produces underclothes and shirts and collars. Guests arrive with trunks and expect their traveling clothes turned around. So the laundry ran on a rhythm, and the rhythm was fixed by physics rather than preference. You wash early in the week so there's drying time. You need weather, because drying outdoors is faster and gentler, and the alternative is a hot drying room that costs fuel. Which means the laundry schedule was hostage to the sky, and a wet week meant everything backed up, and somebody had to decide what got done and what waited. And the physical cost of it was real, and it was permanent. Lye soap strips grease off linen, and it strips oil out of skin. Hands in it all day, every day, crack and bleed, and don't heal properly, because they go back in the next morning. Boiling water gets carried, and carrying is what does backs in. Irons heated on a stove weigh several pounds, and you swing one for hours. The rooms were hot, wet, and loud. People did that work for decades. Francis Collins was in that laundry around the turn of the century. Sarah Scott was still doing it in the late 1920s, 30 years later. Inga Boberg came from Sweden to do it. We know they were there. We know roughly when. We don't know which of them was in that room on that day in 1908, and we probably never will. The keys, though. It's time to open something. Behind those locks sat everything the household consumed and could not easily replace. The still room is the one that needs a word, because the name has fallen out of the language entirely. Originally, it was where a household distilled things, and the name stuck long after the distilling stopped. By the 1890s, It was the room where the preserves lived, and the cordials, the dried herbs, the household remedies, the tea and the coffee, and the fine sugar, the valuable consumables, the things that were expensive, went off, and could walk out of a building in a coat pocket. Hence the lock, not suspicion of any particular person, systematic acknowledgement that 40 people worked in that house, and that tea, at the time, was worth stealing. And the still room tells you something about how a house of this period actually fed itself, which wasn't the way we'd assume. We're used to a world where food arrives finished. Theirs didn't. A great house preserved its own fruit, made its own jams and jellies and cordials, dried its own herbs, and mixed a fair number of its own remedies. When the orchard came in, somebody spent days turning it into something that would still be edible in February. When the garden produced more than the kitchen could use that week, it went into jars. So the still room worked as a small factory on a seasonal clock, and the housekeeper set that clock, which meant a set of decisions every year that nobody upstairs ever saw. How much of the soft fruit goes to the table this week, and how much goes into jars for February? Whether there's enough sugar in the storeroom to do it, and if there isn't, whether it's worth the cost of getting more before the fruit spoils. What to do with a glut, and what to do with a failure. Get that wrong in August, and the house is short in January, and the person who has to explain the shortage is the person who made the call 5 months earlier. There's a particular kind of authority in that, and it's not the glamorous kind. It's the authority of being the only person who is thinking about February. Miss the window on the soft fruit, and you've lost it for a year. There's also a medical dimension we've almost entirely forgotten. Before a doctor was a phone call away, the household kept its own remedies, and in most great houses, it was the senior woman who knew them and dispensed them. Somebody in that building got a headache, or burned a hand on a stove, or came down with something in the night, and the first response wasn't a physician, it was a woman with keys unlocking a cupboard. So the arrangement reframes again. She wasn't guarding the sugar because sugar's precious. She was holding the part of the house that kept everybody in it alive through a winter, and the lock was there because that responsibility had to sit somewhere specific. Anything that sits with everyone sits with no one. The house had worked that out. And since we're in the still room, it's worth staying with the medical side a moment, because illness in a house like that was a management problem before it was a medical one. 40 people living in one building, many of them sharing rooms, most of them young, all of them working long hours in a cold climate. Something moving through that population was not a possibility. It was a seasonal certainty. A bad cold goes round the attic floor in February, and suddenly 3 of your housemaids are unfit, and the same amount of work still has to happen. So the housekeeper is doing triage. Who's genuinely ill and who's exhausted? Who can be moved to lighter duties? Whether this is the kind of thing that needs a doctor, which costs money and is a decision somebody has to authorize. Whether the sick person needs to be isolated from the others, which in a house with shared attic bedrooms is difficult. And whether the family should be told, because a family with young children does not want an infection traveling up the back stairs. None of that decision-making is glamorous, and all of it required judgment, and getting it wrong in either direction had consequences. Send a genuinely sick woman back to work, and you might lose her for a month instead of a week. Rest everyone who says they feel poorly, and the house stops. There's also the plain fact that a servant who became permanently unfit had almost nothing underneath her. No pension in most households. No sick pay as a right. A long illness could end a career, and ending a career at 40, in service, with no savings and no family able to take you in, led somewhere genuinely frightening. That pressure sat under every one of those decisions, and everybody in the building knew it was there. Which is part of why a housekeeper who was fair had real power to make lives better, and one who wasn't had real power to make them much worse. The record doesn't tell us which Emily King was. So the housekeeper's keys were an accounting instrument as much as anything else. When something came out of a locked room, somebody had signed for it, and that somebody was her. She kept track of the household expenses. That phrase is doing a lot of work. It means every pound of sugar and every bottle of wine and every candle was, in the end, her signature. A system like that is designed so trust doesn't have to be a feeling. Nobody had to like Emily King. Nobody had to believe she was honest. The keys and the ledger made her honesty a checkable fact, which is a much more durable arrangement than affection, and considerably more useful to everyone involved. There's one season this house was built for, above all the others. Biltmore opened at Christmas, and Christmas is when a house like that does the thing it exists to do. The work in that is considerable. A tree, cut on the estate and brought into a room with a ceiling high enough to take it, which means getting it upright is an engineering problem, involving several men and rope. Decoration through the main rooms. Guests arriving and staying for days, each one needing a prepared bedroom, fires, hot water, and a valet or maid if they haven't brought their own, which means your footmen are covering strangers on top of their normal work. Then the food. A house party at Christmas is not one big dinner. It's a week of them, plus breakfasts, plus luncheons, plus tea, plus the staff eating around it, out of the same 3 kitchens. And the presents. In many great houses, the family gave gifts to the staff, and somebody had to organize that, which means somebody had to know 40 people well enough to get it approximately right, and to keep a record so that nobody was missed and nobody got the same thing twice running. That was the housekeeper. So the most festive week in that building's year was, for the woman with the keys, the single hardest working stretch of the calendar. Every December for 17 years, the house at its most beautiful, and the person who made it possible moving through the back corridors with a list. And then, for months at a time, the family went away. This is the part of great house life that almost never gets shown, and it might be the most revealing part of the whole system. The Vanderbilts traveled, and they traveled often and at length. Europe, New York, Newport. Weeks at a time, and sometimes months. And Biltmore didn't close. Emily King stayed, and so did the head butler. Between them, they kept the house running with the owners on another continent. They made arrangements for special guests who came to stay while the family was absent, which is a genuinely striking detail, because it means the house continued to function as a social institution without the people whose social institution it was, and they prepared the house for the family's return, which is its own enormous piece of work, because a house that's been quiet for 2 months doesn't simply resume. Damp and dust, fires that haven't been lit, linen that's been folded too long, silver that's gone dull in its bays, clocks that need winding, gardens that need to be at their best on the correct week rather than the week before, food ordered against an arrival date that could move by a fortnight without notice. And underneath all of that sits a question the family never had to think about, which is what you do with 40 people when there's nobody to serve. Great houses handled this with an arrangement called board wages. When the family was away, the full kitchen stopped running, and staff who'd been fed by the house were given a small cash allowance to feed themselves instead. It sounds like a technicality. It wasn't. It changed the actual texture of daily life for everyone below stairs, because suddenly you were budgeting your own food for the first time in months, and depending on how generous the allowance was, that was either a small windfall or a squeeze. It also changed the mood of the building. There's a version of the closed house that's genuinely lighter. Fewer bells, no dressing for dinner, no guests. Work that's real but unhurried, and evenings that belong to you in a way they never do in season. There's something else about those months that's easy to skip past. A house with no family in it has no reason to run to any standard at all. Nobody is coming. Nobody will see. The obvious thing is to let it idle and open it up again a week before they land. That is not what happened, and the record is clear about it, because guests were still arriving and being looked after and leaving satisfied. Which means somebody was holding a standard in an empty building for no audience, month after month, on nothing but their own judgment of what the house was supposed to be. Whether it felt lighter at Biltmore in the months the Vanderbilts were in Europe, nobody wrote down. What the record does show is that the arrangement existed across houses of that class, and that the record shows Mrs. King and the head butler staying on through those months with a reduced establishment and a running house. And here's the part that changes the picture. The house didn't idle, it kept receiving guests. People came to stay at Biltmore while the owners were on another continent, and the arrangements for them were made by the housekeeper, which means a visitor could arrive at the largest private house in America, be shown to a prepared room, be fed properly, be looked after for several days, and leave without the family being in the country. It changes the idea of who a house belongs to. Legally, obviously, it belonged to George Vanderbilt. But a building is also a set of habits, and for months at a time, those habits lived entirely in two people who owned none of it. The fires got lit because she said so. The rooms were ready because she decided which ones. Then a telegram came, and a date got fixed, and the whole building had to be turned back into the other kind of house. She also, and this is my favorite line in the whole record, extended social invitations on Mrs. Vanderbilt's behalf. She acted as a personal secretary of sorts. Read it again. The housekeeper wrote to New York society in her employer's name. And consider what the guests themselves would have understood about it, which is probably nothing at all. A letter arrives from Biltmore. It's correct. It's warm in the right measure. It's signed as it should be. You accept, you travel, you're met. You're fed properly for 3 days. Your room is warm and your clothes are pressed. And you leave with a settled impression of Vanderbilt hospitality. You never learn that the family was in France the entire time, and the impression you formed was the work of a woman from Essex you were never introduced to. You could call that an administrative convenience. It wasn't. So a woman from a village in Essex, who'd been a doctor's servant in London 20 years earlier, was writing letters that moved people around the top of American society. Against the calling card world, that's remarkable. That entire system ran on who wrote to whom, in what terms and how quickly. A card acknowledged, an invitation extended, or quietly not extended. Warmth in the phrasing, or mere correctness. Those were the instruments by which families were placed, and everybody at the top of New York read them like weather. At Biltmore, when the family was on another continent, some of those instruments were being operated by the housekeeper, and she was doing it without ever having been in the rooms where the map was drawn. She'd have had to know the map, who ranks where, which name is currently welcome, and which is being allowed to cool. What warmth looks like from that particular family to that particular household, and what merely correct looks like, and the distance between the two, which is the whole game. And she'd be doing it without the one thing that made it possible for everybody else in that world. Mrs. Vanderbilt learned the map by living in it. She'd been to the dinners, heard the remarks, watched who was cool with whom across 20 years of rooms. Emily King learned it from the outside, standing in doorways, reading correspondence, noticing which cards came back and which didn't, assembling a picture of American high society from the service side of a wall. Then she was trusted to act on it, in her employer's name, unsupervised, from another continent's distance. There is no training for that either. There's a woman who paid attention for long enough that somebody decided she'd got it right. Get it wrong once, and you've made a problem that takes a season to repair, and that nobody will ever explain to you. She did it for years, and there's no letter in the archive in which anyone corrects her. And the family was on a boat. The roster isn't only a list of jobs. Some of these people can be followed. Martha Laub was Edith Vanderbilt's lady's maid from 1913 to 1915. She was German, and she is one of the very few members of that staff of whom a photograph survives at all, donated to the estate archive by a descendant. Think about what that means, next to Emily King. Two women, in the same house, in overlapping years, both senior, both trusted. One of them we can look at. The other we cannot, and never will. The difference isn't importance. It's almost certainly just that somebody in Martha Laub's family kept a picture, and somebody in Emily King's did not, or never had one to keep. That's how thin the line is between a person who survives in the record and a person who nearly doesn't. Wilfred Shackley was George Vanderbilt's valet from 1899 to 1906. 7 years. He was English. A valet at that level traveled with his employer constantly, which meant crossing the Atlantic repeatedly, and the arrangement was quite specific about rank even in transit. Mr. Vanderbilt traveled first class. His valet traveled second. The ordinary strangeness of that is easy to miss. The same voyage, the same ocean, the same days at sea, different decks. The man who dressed him each morning was not permitted to eat in the same room on the way there. There were others we can name and not much more. James Pomp, valet, Dutch, 1913. Horace Pridmore, English, 1911 to 12. Madeline Henry and Laurette Delaplace, both French, both ladies' maids in the early years. And there's a small detail about the ladies' maid's position that I find quietly revealing. She didn't wear a uniform. She wore dresses her mistress had given her, or stopped wearing, and this was understood as a privilege. Take it apart. Your reward for good service is the clothing of the woman you serve, slightly out of date, altered to fit you. You are the best-dressed woman below stairs, and everything you own was chosen by somebody else for herself first. Nobody in that house would have found it strange. It was a genuine mark of favor, and the maids who received it valued it. It's only from here that it looks like what it also was, which is a person wearing a hand-me-down life. So, she had the keys, the ledger, the staff, the correspondence, and the empty house. Which brings us back to where we started, and to the gate. Mrs. King was senior enough to be given real privileges, and the house wrote them down, which is how we know about them at all. She was provided with horses for her own use, which is not nothing. A horse is transport, and it's also freedom. And in the mountains of North Carolina in 1900, it was the difference between being able to leave the estate and not. And she was allowed to keep her own dogs inside Biltmore House. 250 rooms, 40 staff, and the housekeeper has dogs living in the building with her. She was no temporary employee. That's somebody the household has accepted as a permanent feature of itself. And then Edith Vanderbilt had a gate installed in the kitchen hallway to keep those dogs out of the family's part of the house. That gate is still standing. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that a storyteller can bend into something it isn't. Nobody wrote down that this was an insult. Nobody recorded a conversation about it. There's no letter where anyone is upset. What exists is a piece of hardware and a reason for it, and the reason is entirely reasonable. Dogs go where they like. Families with young children and pale carpets install gates. People do this today. So I won't tell you it was cruel. The record doesn't say that, and putting a feeling in a dead woman's mouth to tidy the story is the one thing this cannot do. What I'll say is this: both facts are true at once, and they sit next to each other without resolving. She could unlock every storeroom, every pantry, the china closet and the still room. She wrote letters in her employer's name. She ran the largest house in America for months at a stretch, with nobody above her in it. And there was a corridor where her dogs weren't permitted, and a gate went in to make that permanent, and she went on living and working on her side of it for another decade and a half. That's what a class system looks like when you get close enough to touch it. Not a wall, a gate, low enough to see over, fitted neatly and perfectly polite, and absolutely fixed. She was inside the family's life more deeply than almost anyone alive. She knew what they ate, what they owed, who they were avoiding, when they were ill. And she wasn't of it, and the house had a small iron reminder of that fact bolted into a doorway. The practical shape of it is stranger than the symbolism. She could walk that corridor herself, any hour, any day. Her work required it, and nobody questioned it. It wasn't her the gate excluded. It was the part of her life that wasn't work. The horses and the dogs are the only two things in the whole record that belong to Emily King rather than to the post she held. They're also the two things that mark where her presence stopped being welcome. You can have authority here. You can have the keys, the accounts, the correspondence, the staff, and the run of every floor. What you can't have is a life in these rooms. That's a sharper line than a simple upstairs and downstairs, and the house drew it without anybody having to say a word out loud. 17 years, 1897 to 1914. She arrived at 43, and she stayed until she was 60. The accumulation of that is hard to hold. 17 Christmases in a house built to be spectacular at Christmas. 17 springs of opening the shutters. The staff turning over around her. Because domestic service was a young person's trade, and most people didn't stay. Butlers came and went. Walter Harvey for 2 years. John Burdett for 7. Ladies' maids arrived from France and Germany and left again. Madeleine Henry, then Laurette Delaplace, then Martha Laub. She outlasted all of them, and she was the continuity. When a new footman arrived, not knowing where anything was or who anyone was, the person who taught him was her. When a new butler took over, the institutional memory of that house lived in a woman in a black dress with keys at her waist. And there's one more thing about her that I've been saving, because it belongs here rather than at the start. There's no photograph of her, not one. Not in the archive, not from her family, not anywhere. 17 years running the largest house in the United States, and we don't know what her face looked like. And the house is quite clear about why. Photographs of domestic staff from this period are rare, for 2 reasons. Cameras were expensive, and working people largely didn't have them. And, in the words of the estate itself, remaining unseen was part of the job. That's a job description, not a flourish. Being unnoticed was a professional skill she was paid to have, and she was so good at it that she's no face. What survives is paper. A great deal of correspondence in the Biltmore archives concerning Mrs. King. She's one of the best documented servants in America, and we can't picture her. There's one more thing the absence does, and it's the reason this story is hard to tell any other way. Without a face, there's nothing to project onto. You can't decide from a photograph that she looked kind, or hard, or tired, and then read the rest of the record through that. All you get is what she did. Which, for once, is probably the right way round. There's a way to measure what she was that doesn't need a wage figure at all. Look at the post itself, across the whole life of the house. Laura Barker held it from 1895 to 1897, 2 years. Then Emily King, 17. Then Martha Louise Andrews, 1. Then Laura Howard, 6. Then Bessie Donahue, 8. 5 women across 34 years, and one of them accounts for half of it. Put it another way, if you'd walked into Biltmore House at any point between 1897 and 1914 and asked who ran it, there was one answer, and it never changed. Ask the same question across the 20 years after her, and the answer changes 4 times. In a trade built to make people replaceable, and in a house where almost every other post turned over every 2 or 3 years, she was the thing that didn't move. And that continuity is worth one more thought, because it explains something about the house rather than just about her. A great house doesn't run on written procedure. Almost nothing about how Biltmore actually worked was ever set down. Which room needs the fire lit first on a cold morning? Which supplier is reliable in February? Which 2 members of staff shouldn't be rostered together? How long the good linen takes to come back in a wet week? All of that lived in one person's head, which means that for 17 years, the operating manual for the largest private house in America was a woman from Essex, and there was no copy. When she went, it went. Martha Louise Andrews lasted a year, and I'd guess that had less to do with Andrews than with what she'd been handed. And it's worth being clear about why that file exists at all, because it isn't sentiment. A housekeeper-generated paper, orders, accounts, correspondence with suppliers, letters written on the family's behalf, notes about staff. Every one of those was a business record, and business records got kept when personal ones didn't. Nobody at Biltmore was preserving Emily King. They were preserving the running of the house, and she happened to be the person running it. So we have her because she worked, and only because she worked. Every document in that file exists because a house needed something ordered, paid for, hired, dismissed, stored, or written on somebody's behalf, which means the shape we can reconstruct is precisely the shape of her working life and nothing else. 17 years of decisions and not one recorded opinion. There's a temptation to call that a tragedy. I don't think it is, quite. It's closer to the thing she was actually good at. Preserved by accident. The woman whose professional achievement was to leave no trace left, in the end, an enormous quantity of evidence about a house and almost none about herself. That is either the saddest possible outcome or the most complete professional success in this entire story, and I genuinely cannot decide which. The parts of her that weren't work left no trace, which is exactly the arrangement the gate in the corridor describes. There's something almost funny in that, in a bleak way. The system that required her to be invisible is the same system that wrote everything down. Then, in 1914, George Vanderbilt died. He was 51. The house he'd spent 6 years building and 19 years living in had a widow and a daughter in it, and an estate that was, frankly, more expensive than it was ever going to be sustainable. And soon after, Emily King resigned. The record gives us the sequence and not the reason. We know he died. We know she left. We don't have a letter in which she explains herself, and I'm not going to write one for her. But you can see the shape of it without inventing anything. Her post existed inside a particular arrangement, a household with a master and a mistress, a full establishment, a social calendar, a rhythm of guests and travel and return. The man at the center of that arrangement was gone, and everything downstream of him was going to change. She was 60 years old. She had run that house for 17 years, and she had watched every other senior position turn over several times. Whatever she thought, she didn't stay to find out. And somewhere in that year, in a corridor or a housekeeper's room, she did the thing she'd done once before in reverse. She unhooked the chain from her waist and handed it to Martha Louise Andrews, who lasted a year. All that knowing. Which door in that house held what? How fast it went off? Who was allowed to ask for it? And which of the 40 people downstairs could be trusted with which task on a bad morning? All of it has to move from one head to another in whatever time a handover takes, and almost none of it can be written down. You can hand over keys in an afternoon. You cannot hand over 17 years of knowing which housemaid is reliable in a crisis. The keys transferred in an afternoon, the rest of it left with her. There's one more thing worth saying, because Emily King's timing was not an accident, and it wasn't only about one man dying. She left in 1914. Within a few months of her leaving, Europe went to war, and the world that had built houses like Biltmore began to come apart faster than anyone inside it expected. War took the young men, and a great many of the footmen and hallboys of the great houses went and did not come back. Then it took the young women too, into munitions and offices, and those jobs paid better and left your evenings alone and didn't require you to be invisible. A great many never went back into service. At the same time, taxes rose, and the rents that had carried these houses stopped covering what they cost. Within about 30 years of Emily King handing back her keys, the job she had done at the top of her profession had more or less ceased to exist anywhere in the world. Biltmore itself survived, and the way it survived is worth knowing. It opened to the public in 1930, during the Depression, at the request of the city of Asheville, which needed the tourism. The family kept it by turning the thing that had been the most private house in America into something people bought a ticket to walk through. So the class this whole story has been describing didn't collapse. It converted. The rooms stayed. The system that filled them did not. And it means that the corridor with the gate in it, which existed so that a housekeeper's dogs would not cross into the family's part of the house, is now a corridor that thousands of strangers walk down every year, most of them with no idea that the gate is the most articulate object in the building. And here's where the story does something I didn't expect when I started reading about her. She got married. At 60, after a lifetime in other people's houses, Emily King married a man called W.C. Jones, a widowed farmer from near Raleigh. She moved to Pennsylvania to be near family, which tells us she had family, which is the first hint in the whole record that she'd kept a life outside service at all. And later that same year, the two of them bought an orange grove near Apopka in Florida, a woman born in a village in Essex in 1853, a doctor's servant in London, 17 years in the Blue Ridge holding the keys to a chateau, and now, at 60, an orange grove in Florida with a husband. I find that genuinely wonderful, and I don't think I'm overreading it. There's no version of that life that was planned. Then, in December of 1914, a note of thanks was written from Biltmore. The man who wrote it was Chauncey Beadle, the estate superintendent. He'd arrived at Biltmore in the early 1890s, meaning to stay a few weeks, and he was still there decades later. He and Emily King had worked in the same place for 17 years, one running the house and one running the land around it, both of them permanent fixtures in a household where almost nobody else was. So this isn't a form letter from an institution. It's one long-serving employee writing to another after she'd gone. Two people who between them had held that estate steady while owners came and went and eventually died, and one of them had now left, and the other wrote to say thank you for some fruit. That's what the archive kept. A note about oranges, filed because notes got filed, sitting in a box for 111 years. Mrs. Jones had sent a box of oranges to Biltmore for the holidays. She'd been gone months. She had married, moved states twice, and bought a farm. And at Christmas, she sent fruit from her own trees back to the house she used to run. And a man there wrote to thank her, and somebody filed the note, and it's still in the archive over a century later. The whole relationship, in one box of oranges, no letter about feelings, a shipment, from the new place to the old one, at the time of year when that house was at its most beautiful and its most demanding, and when she'd have known exactly how busy everyone was. There's one more decision of hers in the record, and it's the last one. And then she did one more thing. Emily King Jones bought a boarding house in Apopka, Florida. She ran it herself into the early 1920s. She named it the Biltmore Inn. She named her own house, the first building she ever owned, the only establishment that was ever actually hers, after the house that had employed her. Now, why? I don't know. Nobody knows. The record shows us the name and not the reason, and this is one of those places where the honest thing is to stop and say so. You can build several explanations, and they're all defensible. Maybe it was a business decision, because Biltmore was a famous name, and a boarding house needs to sound like something. Maybe it was pride, because 17 years running the largest house in America is a thing to be proud of, and there was no other way to say it on a sign. Maybe it was habit, or affection, or the simple fact that when she thought of the word home, that building was what her mind produced. Maybe it was all of them. Most human decisions are. But we don't have a letter, and I'm not going to give you a feeling and pretend the archive gave it to me. What we've love is a woman who left a house at 60 and named the next building she owned after it and kept sending oranges. Those three facts sit there. You'll make of them what you make of them, and your reading is as good as mine. She sold up in the early 20s and went back to Pennsylvania. She died there in 1926 at 72. Here's what I want to leave you with. We started with a gate in a corridor, and that gate is the honest summary of the whole arrangement. She held every key, and there was one door she wasn't behind. Both true, neither canceling the other. But the thing the gate can't tell you is what the arrangement was actually made of, and that's what the 17 years show. It wasn't made of grandeur. It was made of a woman going in every morning with a list. It was made of 4 women in a laundry with hot irons and hundreds of stockings. It was made of men feeding boilers out of sight, so the rooms above stayed at the temperature a guest expected without ever noticing. It was made of a chef from France and a laundress from Sweden and a footman from Ireland, assembled in one Appalachian valley for the comfort of a single family. That's the part the rooms don't say. You can stand in Biltmore today, and the house will tell you a great deal about George Vanderbilt's taste and almost nothing about how it stayed warm. And the record is honest about what it can't reach. We know where Emily King was born, what she was paid relative to a week's lodging, who she supervised, what she unlocked, when she left, who she married, what she grew, and what she called the building she bought. We do not know what her face looked like. We do not know what she thought of any of it. Those things weren't written down, because nobody at the time thought they were the interesting part. The great houses of the Gilded Age were built to look like they ran themselves. That was the entire design brief, from the placement of the back stairs to the tunnel under the grass. And they succeeded so completely that 130 years later, we still talk about them as though the marble did the work. 40 people did the work. One of them had the keys. Sleep well.